Herzlich willkommen, Freunde, zu einer weiteren Folge des Afrika für Allmanns Namibia podcast. And of course, a very warm welcome also to our English-speaking audience. As you know, bilingual, Deutsch-English mix. We keep this conversation in English. If there will be some German words, seht es uns nach, dann müssen wir das einfach auf Deutsch sagen. But today we are talking about a very interesting topic with which we have as a guest with us today, the filmmaker, so to say in German, Regisseur Florian Schott. And this is, I think, especially from a perspective of documentary, because Chandra, we are actually also shooting a documentary, right? So maybe what are we objecting here with this episode?
Well, it's basically just to get a look and feel of the arts industry, specifically film, but more focused on storytelling and how we're doing it. So I really want to start off with that. Firstly, welcome to the podcast, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do.
Yes, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Florian Schott. I am a German-born, Namibian-based filmmaker. I've been living in Namibia for 13 years. I started in film and working in film in Germany and learned there in the film industry. And then when film brought me around the world, eventually it brought me to Namibia as well, where I kind of decided, let me stay here. And I got to know the film practitioners in the country. I got to know Namibian storytellers. I got to know Namibian musicians. And it was really such a rich culture of talent and so much great untapped potential when it comes to storytelling that I kind of decided to put my base here and start working in the film industry this side.
Okay. So I mean, storytelling is a broad term, right? I'm running this podcast now for the first time. There's also a camera running, but let's be fair, it's an audio format. So my storytelling was always there's a guy with some African friends, African networks, and an interest for specific topics, and he presents that to them, and it was some form of, let's say, authentic educational format. How would you describe storytelling in the media, in the sense of film industry, and why is it so important?
I mean, as you said, of course, like there's so many different ways of storytelling, but if you look at sort of like human history, I mean, just the telling of stories, it's always been an important staple of humanity for as long as we can remember, for as long as there's any kind of written word or anything that's orally kind of like stories that are from generation to generation passed down. So filmmaking is of course like the youngest tool in the kind of storytelling. Of course, there was like oral storytelling, but also books way earlier than film. And film is only 100 years old, but at the same time also it is in the end in terms of the way that it can immerse yourself and immerse an audience by I'm talking about both documentary and narrative film. It is so much stronger than a lot of the other stories because you do see either recreations or imagery of something that works with all parts of your brain. Because obviously you're seeing pictures, it's kind of like you have an emotional reaction to it. You read a book, of course you have the same, but of course like film is the one discipline that kind of brings all of these together.
Interesting. I mean, from my understanding always, a podcast maybe is in that sense similar because at least you don't need to be literate, right? You can just listen to it. Of course, there's still the language barrier. I guess with a film, the entry level could be even zero, right? If it's just documentary without a lot of words. I noticed, for example, many Namibian documentaries deal with nature. And that is also something I've been always wondering about. Why is the documentary scene, or let's say the film scene, focused on Namibia so much concerned with all these different, let's say, geographic aspects? And I see now a few ones, Chandra, you showed me one also concerning the genocide now, but predominantly is that correct, that Namibian film that we perceive as mostly nature and geography?
I mean, just in terms of if we talk from a business standpoint, of course, like you see that the most of the stuff that gets produced here in terms of film does have to do for sure with nature as documentary, and nature photography is just a big part of the kind of the film and documentary infrastructure worldwide. So of course, like if you look at kind of like how many production companies leave some money in Namibia, that is definitely nature filmmaking is sort of like way up there, because the landscapes and the animals and stuff are unique, and
Absolutely.
we have certain features here that are unique worldwide. But of course, like there's also the other aspect, of course, in terms of storytelling, in terms of history, in terms of which is very unique here in Namibia as well.
And which kind of storytelling do you like to perceive? What is the thing that you think Namibia is missing in terms of storytelling of films?
Look, the thing that I'm specializing in is narrative film.
Okay.
And so I am working, of course, more in I've got a lot of friends and helped a lot in documentary filmmaking and stuff as well. But the thing that I learned and that I trained in is narrative film. Narrative film is, I think, a very strong method in terms of getting a reaction and getting an emotional reaction from an audience. It's something, because if you're telling a story emotionally, it affects, it goes straight into your brain differently. It doesn't sort of use the intellectual part of your brain, but it goes straight into the center, into your brain and your heart. But at the same time, also the challenge is that narrative film is a very expensive medium, because you do need more crew and cast in a documentary. You do need to kind of like, in terms of your equipment, in terms of your locations, in terms of your story writing, in terms of the editing. It is a very expensive medium, and of course this presents a lot of challenges for Namibian film.
Interesting.
So what motivated you to set up your filmmaking base here in Namibia specifically?
Look, when I came to Namibia in 2008, I came here for the first time, and I've been traveling quite a lot around the world, and I've been making films before, like all over Europe and in Turkey and South Africa, South America, in the Antarctica. But when I came to Namibia, I fell in love with the country, and I fell in love with one woman in particular. And so I kind of decided that maybe I could try to set my base down here. And what I didn't know back then is the wealth of stories that are untold. Because I sometimes feel like if you're making films in Europe or in the US, it's kind of like, it seems like every story is kind of told already. And you're so many times you're telling a very similar story, just you decorate it a little bit differently. But the wealth of stories that I've never heard of, where I felt like this is fantastic. It's like there's so much untapped potential, I felt. And of course, like the longer I stayed here, the more I got to know other practitioners in film, other storytellers, other musicians, poets, and I kind of really felt like maybe I have a space in here that I can not only tell stories but also help amplify the voices of the practitioners in the creative industry here.
I think a general concern normally, or a general narrative people would normally have is who tells Namibian stories, right? And then from your perspective, and in terms of the work that you have done, how much of an inclusive cast and crew have you had to be able to make sure that the story is also authentically told from the Namibian standpoint?
Yeah, I think this is a huge topic, and I think this is something that's really important when it comes to perspective. Not only the perspective of what perspectives the story told in, but at the same time also who is actually able to deliver that perspective. I think for me it was especially in the years that I've been making film here, it's been a huge learning curve, of course. I think when I came here, almost a little bit naively, I kind of thought like, but we are all human, so we can relate to human emotions. And I think in a certain way that is true, but I wouldn't do the same anymore now. I think it was always important to me to tell the story with an original Namibian cast. If it's, for example, if it's set in Namibia, you don't want, even if there's more maybe experienced South African actors or something, it's still not the same as if you have someone, if we're making Katutura, the film Katutura, to have actually people that have walked the street of Katutura and that know the place. But at the same time also in the stories that I'm telling now, in the development of these stories, it's really important, for example, if there's a very female-centric, female-driven film, that of course like the writer or the director or both should be female as well. So there's certain things in storytelling where the perspective of the person that tells the story is really important, and because like there's certain stuff that I can't as a white male, certain things that I cannot relate to the same as someone that is from here that has had different experience than me. So what I'm trying to do is, especially in my writing, to kind of like to collaborate as much as I can, but then in the work, in the shooting of the film, the same. So you're always trying to collaborate as much as possible with people on the ground that have that experience.
And would you say that this is a common thing amongst other filmmakers that come to Namibia to shoot films here?
I think the mindset is, of course, like from person to person different. And I think like also having talked a lot to other filmmakers, I think it's a huge spectrum between people saying like, look, I can tell any kind of story, or between someone that says like, look, I want to take myself back and really listen more. So it is a spectrum, of course. But I think what I've been seeing more and more in the last couple of years is that filmmakers really get sensitive about these issues and about perspective and about who can tell what kind of story.
What kind of emotions do you think does a good storytelling lead to? Because I mean, as I said, my format is in its objective very, very clear forward. I want to educate people, open some new perspectives. But I mean, a movie is important, right? I mean, let's go back. Whenever you cried in the past, it was, if I look back at Titanic or whatever, I mean, it's always somehow related to visuals. And how big is that role of emotions in storytelling, and how do you actually have a tool also to target certain emotions? Can you create an emotion, or is that just something that depends solely on the person perceiving it?
I mean, just to answer the first part of your question, it works, of course, like narrative film works on a completely different level, because it's not the intellectual part of your brain that kind of gets activated. Also, that might be the case, but of course, like that's much more in documentary filmmaking. But it goes straight to the emotional center of the brain, and especially, for example, I was doing a film that deals with the environment and rhino poaching in Namibia, and this film was meant to be for children. And our first brief, when we kind of thought about the film, was sort of like to make a documentary, but we decided to tell a family story, and a story that the kids can relate to. And I think, because it activates a completely different part of your brain, it also it goes a little bit deeper than if you just present like an intellectual kind of presented intellectually. So I think this is why I really focus on narrative film more, because I feel like it's going a little bit deeper potentially. And of course, like there's a lot of different options to create these kind of emotions, and there's of course a lot of shortcuts and tricks that one can use, and one can work with music, and one can work with all kinds of other like tear-jerking scenes. But I think at the end, if you tell a story that is really human and presents a human dilemma, it will always work. And
do you have maybe an example? Because I think people sometimes struggle with these words, narrative storytelling. Maybe an example of a narrative film where the storytelling led to a certain emotional reaction for the viewer?
I think, like, I mean, there's so many. I mean, you just mentioned Titanic now. It's just like the tragedy of what happened. I think it's not only is it the gravity of the kind of the loss of life, but of course, like, quite smartly, they of course like centered it around a love story that is just as tragic as the exterior event. And even if you're making a film you could make a film here in Namibia, you could do a film in South America, in the US. There's certain human emotions that are global, that we all have. We all have been in love. We all know the feeling of heartbreak. We all know the feeling of loss of a loved one. We all know the feeling of kind of a sense of security or not because of your family and your parents. And of course, if you can tap into these deep human emotions, you can make a film that for example, like I was saying with the film that we made here in Namibia, it's about a little girl that grows up in a village in Namibia, but people still in the US or in Europe could relate to her because there's certain human traits and human emotions that we just all have wired into our brains. And it doesn't matter if you're telling a story from Namibia or from Germany or from Tibet or from Australia, we will empathize with other human beings that go through similar things as we've been going through.
Yes. So how do we optimize the film industry in Namibia so that we are able to retain more of the revenue created in the industry? Because I mean, we've seen that most of the films that are produced here are normally produced from people from outside that come in, and then they come with the funding, the equipment, and so on and so forth. But how do we create that capacity so that a Namibian filmmaker would be able to operate on the same capacity within the future?
This is a challenge that we've been facing for quite a while, and I think a big factor why you see more films from people from the outside than from the inside of Namibia is because we are still working on very low budgets. The reason being is Namibia, with its very small population, as you know, presents a very small market as well. So, of course, like if you're making a film in Namibia and you just want to make your money back just by ticket sales in the cinema, or will it used to be DVD sales or something, it would be very limited. And of course, like even the big streamers that are coming in now, like Netflix, Amazon, Disney, etc., they are, of course, looking and expanding their markets and expanding their subscriber base. And of course, that can work very well in countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, maybe even Kenya. But of course, they have all like populations of 50 million up. And we, with our 2.5 million people, are not really that interesting for the streamers. I think, but at the same time also, we do want to keep our Namibian identity, right?
Yes.
I mean, we do want to tell authentically Namibian stories.
Yes.
This is what I think is also important for a society, that stories are told from the inside and people are not just watching films made in the US or even South Africa. I think what we have to do is try to tell our stories as authentically as possible, but at the same time have an eye on that they're accessible also to audiences outside of the country. Because if we want to make money with our films, we have to sell them outside of the country as well. So they are interesting just as well to people in South Africa, in Nigeria, or maybe even worldwide. But of course, for this one, I think the tricky thing is not losing our authenticity on the way and really keeping everything that's kind of culturally unique about Namibia, to keep this in the film, but as I mentioned, try to make them in a way that they can still sell around the world.
I always have this example in my head when I hear talk about Namibia, and you also, Chandre, mentioned it before. It's a very small population, but in Europe, for example, when I was a student, I really loved the Danish films. They have this. I feel like they've captured this niche of, let's say, a bit dark, humorous, but also a bit dystopian, Mads Mikkelsen, etc. But they somehow managed with a very limited budget and limited. I think there was even some agreement, right, that they just reduced the production cost to some amount. They kind of niched a part that now all over Europe. I mean, I prefer them over German films to some extent. Have there? Do you see maybe some potential in the Namibian film industry to, within all these other different markets, to have maybe a specific niche that they can then that they can scale on?
Yes, for sure. I think like Danish film is actually a really good example. One though, because it has been funded quite heavily by the government, etc. as well,
interesting.
Especially in the earlier stages, and it's like it definitely helped to kind of like create that niche in the first place, something that we don't quite have here. There's some government funding that one can get for Namibian film, but not on the same level.
Okay, of course.
And the other thing that Danish film actually did fantastically is kind of like in marking out that kind of like making films that are that unique, that even if you don't speak Danish and if you're somewhere in Germany or Italy or France, it's something that you can't get from inside of your own country. Yeah. So of course you're watching the Scandinavian films because they are just like different, because like there's a certain part of the market that they kind of occupied that has not been there before. Exactly. And I think like especially with African film, I think we didn't quite have that kind of breakthrough yet. But I do believe that, as I mentioned before, there's such a wealth in stories here. I think once it kind of catches on, that you can get very different kind of stories and also a different kind of storytelling than you would get in the kind of the Western market, the Europe and the US. Then I think we do definitely have a space that we can occupy as well. It's just like I mean, in the last years, Korea, for example, came up hugely in film, and Korea was always something. South Korea that were like for film insiders. There were a couple of filmmakers that one would follow and a couple of breakout films. But I think in the last years, especially in with the streamers, it kind of democratized film in a way that now, before you could only watch, like in Germany, for example, on German television, some German films or some American films, but only the stuff that they wanted you to watch. And now kind of with the streamers, it became much more of worldwide produced series that one watches now. So I think African film didn't quite have that breakthrough yet, but I'm sure, and I mean, there is a space for it, and there's a spot for it. And I think the time is kind of ripe, and I think it's going to be happening in the next couple of years, that we will have, I mean, I'm talking first now about African film,
Yes.
A bigger space in the global market. And then I think Namibia is also ready to kind of like take a space in that market as well.
Interesting. I always find in this aspect very interesting that within film, especially, you mentioned it now, the financing aspect, and that is coming from, in the Danish example, at least from the government. How does the financier influence the storytelling? I mean, take your films maybe as an example. Who finance them, and do you think that that has an impact also later on the storytelling of the film?
I think this is one of the things why I think there's such a demand for world cinema, because you see from the American market now that it kind of feels like, of course, like there's always like some great films that are being produced, but if you look at the highest level of even what we're seeing worldwide in cinemas, it sometimes feels like it's kind of all the same, and it kind of feels like, oh yeah, it's the formula that works, just put a little bit differently, because there is so much money involved, and because like people are risk averse when it comes to money. In my own experience with my own films, I always felt like that there was a tremendous freedom. But of course it comes with the smaller budget as well. The less money you spend, the less money is kind of, you can take more risks, because of course it's you don't have to make this and this much millions of dollars back again. But of course, like if you're looking at even streamers potentially producing here, I mean, they've been producing, of course, quite a lot already in Nigeria, in South Africa, Kenya. There's, of course, like certain market demands that come with it, and certain sort of like demands on the filmmakers in terms of the way that they're supposed to tell their stories. But one, of course, has to juggle always as a filmmaker how much you kind of give up your creative control and for how much are you willing to kind of sacrifice in terms of your financial control. So it's always a battle, but I think like as we are still a very small market and small film community that we have this side, and I think also the films that we are making right now work on quite low budgets. I think right now we are not in the situation where we have to fear being kind of censored in a way or in any way kind of pushed to tell a story a certain way. Which I think is great, because I think we should have the freedom, and if we want to carve out a space for Namibian film in the global market, we have to do something that's unique. We have to do something that is not the same as South Africa. We have to do something that's different from Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, or the rest of the world.
Yeah. So would you say that there's equity in terms of the way that these big streaming companies engage with filmmakers and storytellers across the continent? And perhaps is it time for Africa just to be able to start its own platforms that can, that can lead African stories?
There are a lot of pushes in that direction, and there have been quite a number of streaming services coming out of Africa as well. And also I've seen great pushes where African streamers are working with cell phone providers, because one of the big issues here is not only the subscription itself, like by Netflix, but also the data that you're using for it. So of course now there's more streaming services popping up where actually they're working with like a Telecom or MTN or something, where you get basically the data for free if you're streaming something. So there are models that are being implemented, and of course, like they're on the worldwide market, they're not getting as far through as Netflix and Amazon and the big sort of global players. But I do believe that when people watch a little bit more African films, there will also be a rise in kind of African platforms for these.
Let's go into that, because I think then we also shift a bit into the German-Namibian relation in the film industry. But for a moment, I would wish you guys a little break, and then we are right back with the second half.
Mit uns bist du on air. Pool Podcast Agency. Deine Stimme in der Welt.
Willkommen zurück. Welcome back, guys, to this episode on the film industry and German-Namibian storytelling. So I was wondering, since we talked a lot about the ideas behind it, can you guys give me maybe a concrete concrete Namibian movie? Because Chandre, over all these years, I must say, I realized in this pause, I've never watched a Namibian movie, aside, of course, of all the documentaries and stuff. But like, what is there?
Well, to be very honest, I've not watched a lot of Namibian movies. I've seen Katatura. Obviously, it was very well marketed, even domestically, to Namibians. So I've been, privileged enough to see that. But I think maybe that's what we should delve into. Do you think that Namibians consume our own content enough, or is movies normally always made with this idea that the market is too small, the target market is outside of Namibia?
It is, to be honest, quite tricky because Namibia, just the way that it's made up, to really kind of make films and cater for all Namibians. Because of course, like there's so much focus on Windhoek itself, because of course, like this is where the biggest part of the big population lives, and of course, like there it's quite easy. We have 2 cinemas here. We have a lot of places where we can screen films. But of course, when it comes to especially going into the rural areas and all the villages where people would love to consume Namibian films, the setups aren't there. So of course, like it does take a lot of effort to come in with a screen, with a projector, to show films there. We've been doing this with a number of films, but of course that's another costly thing that not every film can afford to.
But don't they also have smartphones? I mean, theoretically, isn't it inaccessible for people in the rural?
Yes, although you do have to account for, of course, again, internet. You do first off have to have strong internet, which is not always the case in the rural areas. And also, data is very expensive here. So also streaming films on the internet is something that not everybody can afford. So there are a lot of hurdles when it comes to bringing Namibian film to all Namibians. And there are a lot of like concepts. There's a lot of like, for example, with the short film that I made, Bahu and the Giants, because we made it with the support of the Legal Assistance Center. And they have a screen and projector, and they're actually going to schools all around the country to show the film. But of course, this is just like one example, and a lot of filmmakers that are doing a film already on quite a low budget might not have the means to then also bring the film to other parts of
Namibia across the country. Yeah.
I mean, are there then though the demands for that? I mean, I can understand the argument that the infrastructure is maybe not there, or maybe also the facilities for that. But do you think young Namibians want to watch local film?
100%. Yeah. I think like it's such because like I think so many.
I mean, is the medium film still what they want? Let's maybe phrase it this way, because I mean we know it from the attention span. I mean, 1.5 hours.
I think everyone wants to see themselves, within the content that they consume, and I think that is a great inspirational point for Namibians to be able to say, there's someone that looks like me, speaks like me, that's acting in a film and that appears in a film. Am I right? And
that's 100%, because I think it's so important that we have, as kids especially, role models or that we have representation, and just in terms of course, like the different Namibian languages, hearing your own vernacular in like a film, and I mean, it's something huge. It's something that's not replaceable by any American film. If you really see kind of like someone that grew up like you, or someone that speaks the same language as you, or just the streets that you are walking on every day, and you see like a big film scene being shot there. I think this kind of representation is so important to a society.
But sorry, please.
I just wanted to ask, so when saying that, how do we, with all of these challenges you mentioned the market, the financing of films in Namibia, but how do we create space for young and upcoming Namibian filmmakers to be able to excel in their craft?
I mean, the one good thing that happened in the last couple of years, or one of the good things, of course, like with the, not only with the streamers, but also with YouTube, with all those kind of like more internet-based kind of platforms to showcase film in any kind of form. Because I mean, I'm not just talking about now feature films, right? It could also be a short film. It could also even be like a sketch that one is doing for a TikTok or for other social media. But even with that, there are now way more outlets than used to be even like 10 years ago to showcase your stories. And I've seen so many young Namibians kind of like, especially during the pandemic, kind of just like being bored and just pick up a camera and film themselves with some friends and maybe like shoot an action scene or do like a web series or something. And this is coming up more and more. So I think that especially for young filmmakers, because also of course like more people have smartphones than they used to have. So we have now, you can shoot a film, you can edit a film, you can like put music on your film, you can all do this from your phone literally and upload it directly on the internet. So I think we have a much more democratized industry now worldwide that I think like especially young Namibian filmmakers can use so much more instead of waiting for kind of like the big funding to come in and just sort of like pick up a camera, because now we almost all have cameras in our pockets, and shoot a film.
And what would you say, what role can film and storytelling play in the relations between Germany and Namibia? Being a German yourself, working in Namibia, and
I think that when it comes to, films create empathy, right? And I think there's so many times that if you're in another part of the world, you see that there's so much misconceptions and misunderstandings about another country or another society. So even, I have to admit, before I came to Namibia for the first time, I had no idea what to expect. I didn't really know. I know it's a country in Africa. I had been in South Africa before, but I didn't really know not only about like Namibia in terms of its kind of like its natural beauty, but also in terms of just the openness of the people and how kind of like, I had no idea that I would make it my home a year later, just because I felt so well here. And I think that film and telling stories from this part of the world, not only for a local audience is really important, but also to create understanding, to create empathy, and especially when it comes to countries like Germany that have such a difficult history with Namibia, it is also important to have that kind of understanding and have that kind of different perspective on another country, a perspective that comes from the inside out and not just from looking from the outside in.
Interesting. I mean, you have the experience of having started your career also in Germany, and now I guess many of the films that you guys mentioned also have been at least aired later on in Germany, right? What is your perception of the German market regarding films from or at least about Namibia? Is there a demand, or do you think there's still a lot of room to develop?
There's definitely a lot of room to develop. I think there hasn't been any Namibian films really that have been like playing at a cinema in Germany, for example, yet. Because there hasn't been really that, but even there haven't been a lot of African films playing at German cinemas and getting like a proper German distribution outside of course now like the streamers that are coming in now. I think the only film that I remember, and as a teenager I was working in a cinema, so I was really trying to watch as much as possible. I think the only African film that I can remember watching in a cinema was Tsotsi, which is a South African gangster drama.
Nirgendwo in Afrika? No, it's not.
But that's a German film. It's set in Africa, but it's not like it's more of a German film, of course.
Does that give an indication that you watch German films set in Africa?
But of course, but for example, that film Tsotsi, it only got distribution because it got the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film.
Okay.
So of course it came with a big kind of like awards, and that's why you have the market for it. But as I mentioned now, with the democratization of the streamers, we can have more access to African film. And although they didn't quite break through yet, and I do not know of sort of a lot of examples of African films that kind of like are in the kind of the zeitgeist in Germany, I think this is something where it's just time, because as I mentioned before as well, it feels sometimes when it feels like in the cinemas from the Americans, everything kind of feels the same. We have a lot of superhero films, we have like Star Wars, we have like all the big kind of like franchises. But if you want to have something that's really different in terms of storytelling, you can look to Africa and to kind of like to new sources of storytelling and just like a completely different way of telling a story. But that hasn't broken through yet. Okay. So I don't think there are any examples, and there's definitely room.
But what about your films? I mean, you made them. I'm sure you didn't lock them from the German audience, right? There was for sure some interaction. What was the feedback you got from them?
It's quite difficult to break through on the global market, because just there is such a big sort of like there's so many films being produced all around the world. So for example, with my first feature film, Katatura, we had a run at a lot of festivals. We were in the US, we showed the film in Germany as well.
Okay.
And of course like a lot of screenings here in Namibia. Of course like here we I think we sold out screenings for like almost 2 years, because like people really wanted to watch this local film because they hadn't seen like a film on that scale from Namibia before. So that's why it became such a phenomenon here. But then it didn't quite translate, like for example in Germany, because then even 6 years ago, to get a distributor, they would have to put up marketing costs, and they would, like if you want to get the film into cinemas, you have to have press screenings, and you have to have like the billboards, and you have to have all this kind of stuff where there just hasn't been that kind of trust yet. So of course, like a lot of like my friends, my family have watched the film, and it's actually on YouTube now, on like an African film channel. But it's still a kind of niche in Germany when it comes to African films.
Something that I've been noticing now, I mean, this year there's a new film coming out on German and Namibian colonial past, right? It's a narrative film, if I don't miscorrect,
yes.
right? The last time I remember was Platz unter der Sonne. I think the title even changed now, right?
Yeah, it's called now Der vermessene Mensch.
Okay, and maybe can you just elaborate us a bit more, because I think it picked up some controversy also here in Namibia, what this film is broadly about, and why it has led to such at least the trailer has led to some turbulences in the media.
Yes, the film, I actually got involved quite early on. The film is a German-produced film of quite a high budget for for German standard and for African standards for sure. It's written, directed by Lars Kraumer, and he tells the story of an anthropologist traveling to Namibia during the time when Namibia was a German colony and during the time of the genocide towards the Herero and the Nama population here, which many are saying is the first genocide of the 20th century. And of course, and these atrocities that are still being debated now in terms of when it comes to payments for reparations, etc., of course is a hot topic. But I think with this film, and I've been involved as I did the casting for all the Namibian parts in the film, and also some of the acting coaching and language coaching for some of the cast. And this film, I think, is extremely important because many Germans don't know about the colonial times, and because, you probably know as well from your history lessons, the Holocaust is such a big, huge topic that kind of everything that happened earlier is kind of quickly put to the side. I think I knew from my childhood, Namibia was a German colony once, but I never learned more about what really happened here and how it kind of what happened here, of course, what the Germans were doing here kind of led to later on the Second World War. And I think although it is kind of you can see it in textbooks, you can have the pictures, that having a narrative film tell that story is so much more direct and will show people so much more immediate the impact of what really happened. And I think it also can create so much stronger direct emotions than any kind absolutely. Of any written book could.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's easy always to talk about racism and stuff and read about it. I mean, even in university, but to see actually someone with a lineal at my friend's head and then basically saying you're worth less than me, that does something much more deeper than just the theory behind it.
What impact do you think this film will have?
I think one can only hope that it sparks debate. I think that it really, I hope that the film will kind of spark the debate about what Germany was doing, and also when it comes to, of course, the stalled negotiations when it comes to reparations for Namibia, and what should be the next steps. How do you deal with your colonial past? Because there's so many, of course, Germany is only one of the many colonial powers in Europe especially, and I think it's, like I said, there's many things were written about it, and there's a lot of documentaries about it as well, but I hope that when this film comes out and gets to a wider audience, that people can really kind of feel the impact of what really happened and what it meant also for Namibians and for the Herero population and for culture that were basically destroyed back in the day. So I hope that with this kind of creating empathy and creating kind of a visceral reaction to what happened, that maybe this debate gets a little bit more in the foreground again.
Interesting. I mean, it's painful to some extent to watch. I assume also for Namibians, right? I mean, to just realize actually the extent of science theory that was laid upon these reduction in humanity, basically, right? So, I mean, I'm very curious, actually, how's that going to tackle? I can imagine the German side. I would be curious, maybe, Shanti, how do you think, does it open new wounds again? Will it lead to some outcry, or do you think it's just another piece of drop on the lake?
Definitely, I think it will have an emotional effect. Namibians still live on a day-to-day basis with the trauma very much in their face of colonialism. I mean, you have people that are still alive, could tell you stories from 1 or 2 generations before them, of the impact of the genocide. So I do think that it will definitely stir some emotions in Namibia, especially with these negotiations also, stalling at the moment and continuing. But I think it's important, just in my opinion, that it's very important that the story is told from the right narrative as well. And I think that will
and the
also,
storytelling here,
yes.
I guess. That's
which narrative is it being told from the German side? Is it being told from the Namibian side?
and who's financing the film, by the way?
I mean, this is a really good point because it is actually it is told by a German writer-director that is not from Namibia, that didn't know Namibia well before. So it is also told from a German's perspective because he was also saying like he could not appropriate a kind of a Namibian perspective.
Of course.
So it is, it is financed in Germany, of course, with different film fundings, etc. So the usual way you would do
but that's justified, right?
German
I mean,
film.
you want to make discussion in Germany, right? That's,
exactly.
I understood this was the time.
Exactly. I think it should be sparking a big discussion in Germany. But I think what Lars was always saying, the director, and what I really sort of think is the right way to go about it, to say like, look, this is a conversation starter, and we hope that maybe with this film there will be more space to fund also films that are told from the Namibian's perspective.
Okay.
But then it shouldn't be from a German that comes in, and then it should be a Namibian, potentially a hero writer, director, or a group of people from Namibia that could create another side of the story. But again, this is the perspective that a Namibian then can tell from that side and not from the German side of things.
Interesting. Is the storytelling? Sorry.
I just wanted to quickly ask you, what do you expect is going to be the reaction in Germany, especially amongst young people?
Well, the point is, I think among young people, actually, we're getting at a very fast stage because I think the sensitivity is coming. I mean, you mentioned textbooks. I think it's now at least starting with it. But I think a film can be very nice because finally now, other than, for example, also this podcast, this goes to everybody. And especially if you look into cinema participation rates, this is much more representative to also middle, old people. Because let's face it, if you make history books, no old people or no, my parents don't go to history class. I mean, they might be now sensitized. But the majority who has never learned about that in school and who has other struggles now with, I mean, let's be fair, Germany is not in a position of calm and financial stability these days. It is actually quite hard to imagine that this could be done in another way than with some entertainment. So I think the media is a good tool. I would recommend all of you guys to check out the film once it's out there. And maybe some last words. What do you guys wish for the Namibian film industry for our next conversation?
I actually do hope that we'll be able to sort of break through on the international market. Because once the world kind of knows about Namibian stories, I think there will be much more interest. I do hope also that the Namibian government, but also maybe even in collaboration, because there's a lot of course, like German, Namibian, there's cultural funds, there's things like the World Cinema Fund for cinema. I think there's a lot of room to grow, and both with money from inside of the country, but also from outside of the country. I hope that Namibian filmmakers get enough funding so that we can tell Namibian stories from the inside, and also then bring these stories out into the world.
Very nice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for this opportunity, guys.